Okay, hello everybody. I am Jorge Filmus, the president of Science for Peace, and I welcome everybody to this lecture that, or more than lecture, I would say, an exchange of opinions regarding the very critical situation that the world is going through. Here in Science for Peace, we are very concerned about the ongoing crisis, the war in Ukraine particularly, where even there is the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. And we thought that this is a good opportunity to discuss between us what alternatives there are to the violent solution of international conflicts. And we thought it would be an excellent idea to bring to our conversation Michael Beer, who is the director of Nonviolent International since 1998. He's a global activist for human rights, and he's been campaigning against war for many years and trained activists in this regard in many countries around the world. He's a frequent public speaker on nonviolence and has presented his positions all around the world. Michael is going to talk briefly about his view of the current situation and the use of nonviolence, and he is also going to answer questions by Richard Sambrook and Leanne McKenna. Richard is Vice President of Science for Peace, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. And Leanne has been doing work in conflict zones for over 30 years and facilitating local initiatives for peace. So, Michael, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to see wonderful, familiar faces and names. Many of you are activists and very impressive scholars and researchers. So it's a privilege to speak with you, and I'm hoping to learn a lot from you today. I'll share with you some of my perspectives and approaches, which I hope will not be repetitive and hope will open up new opportunities for us to think about things together. I certainly don't have all the answers, but appreciate that you're giving the time here today to not just listen to me, but for us to work together and listen well to each other. I'm director of Nonviolence International, and we've been a resource center supporting nonviolent movements for social change and against dictators for a long time. And we've certainly been very engaged in the recent times with three conflicts which have a connection with each other. An important connection that we believe is a step forward towards ending the institution of war and militarism. We've been very involved in Palestine work. We've been very involved in Western Sahara work and in Ukraine work for many, many years, all three of these. What do they have in common? They have something very specific in common, these three. And that is that they all, according to the UN, they all are territories of countries that have been annexed by their neighbors by military force against international law. These are the three, plus Golan, which is technically Syria. But these are the three or four cases of, in terms of international law, where we have neighbors seizing territory and annexing them. And the world really does need to draw a red line against countries seizing neighboring territory and annexing it. As we all probably know, most countries of the world, maybe with the exception of Iceland, have historical claims on neighboring territory for various reasons. And we will not be able to really make a dent in war making unless we can internationally come together and collectively draw that red line and say, okay, nobody's going to be seizing neighboring territory by force and annexing it. It's not surprising that some of the world's imperial powers are involved in some of these annexations. The United States is a big cheerleader of Israel and Morocco in invading and occupying those countries and then recognizing the annexations of East Jerusalem and Golan and Western Sahara. And Russia has been a big, obviously deeply involved and directly annexing territories in Ukraine. This is not to say that there aren't other problems of occupation around the world that also need to be addressed. But in terms of narrowly trying to get started here with a global campaign to start with at least the worst of the worst, which is the annexations, these three conflicts have something in common. And we at Nonviolence International believe that if we can put effort into supporting the nonviolent resistance side of things in these areas to these annexations, that this is a contribution that we can make to begin corralling the institution of militarism and war. Of course, there are other reasons why folks go to war. The US went into Iraq for the oil, and there are other kinds of reasons why various countries are invading. And you got Russia setting up kind of client states near, in Georgia and whatnot. But that's one of the things that we're doing, focusing on strategically, and we would like to have more discussion with you about that here to see whether there might be other groups that may also agree that this is a good way forward in terms of trying to building a worldwide peace movement by starting with the annexation problem. I'd like to say that in terms of nonviolent resistance, for many years at Nonviolence International, we've been collecting nonviolent tactics and/or methods, building on Gene Sharp's 198, and we've come up with 350. You can find this at tactics.nonviolenceinternational.net. Our database of 350 at the moment, and it's growing because there's so many. And I've written a book that the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict asked me to write about the updating Gene Sharp's 198 methods and the categories and whatnot. And I've produced a book that's free download on the nonviolenceinternational.net website. And you can read it in English, and it's now translated into Spanish and Farsi and may be in Russian soon. I think I've done a number of things in this book that are of interest to many of you. Certainly just collecting an enormous range of nonviolent tactics and methods that didn't exist when Gene Sharp first collected his in 1973. And I've added some that he even missed, and have collected a whole lot since that have been done. So the scope, I'm a Steven Pinker fan, and I don't have a doomsday approach to the world. I actually think that things are in some respects going quite well. And one of the areas that things are going quite well is that we're seeing nonviolent resistance in action in basically every country of the world, almost on a daily basis in some fashion. And it's great to see social power working in a fairly intentional way, often in many countries and places around the world, whether it's social movements, whether it's political or economic movements. We're seeing a scale and diversity of nonviolent resistance that is really unique in human history and very exciting. And I'm hopeful that with support from all of you and the work we're doing, that we can rack up a whole lot more victories. The biggest victory this week I'm celebrating is the victory in Cuba, where they had a referendum based on decades of work that have essentially recognized homosexuality, same gender marriage, and gender issues as being fundamental human rights. And it won with 3/4 of the vote. So we're marching on with valuable, important social movement successes even this week. And so let's see the glass half full, not just always half empty. I would like to share briefly one of the major conclusions about that I've reached in gathering all these nonviolent tactics. And what I've come up with, I hope you can see it. Unfortunately, the slide is the wrong size, so I can't make it full screen. Can you see this, or is it too small? What I've done here is I've taken Gene Sharp's categories of nonviolent action, or methods he calls them, and I've just slightly expanded them and tweaked it. And I've tweaked it based on what I believe are the mechanisms of nonviolence. Nobody's ever really tried to come up with the mechanisms of nonviolence before, except for maybe Doug Bond, who I've borrowed from. Douglas Bond is a great researcher who's not well known, who's done really important research in nonviolent action. And I've tweaked some of his mechanisms and come up with a categorization based on those mechanisms of nonviolent action. On the left hand, they're in orange. On the left-hand side, you can see controlling resources. This is what people do. They can either do it through saying, through not doing, or through creating and doing. But basically, we have nonviolent action, the universe of nonviolent action manifesting itself in these three different ways of saying, not doing, and creating and doing. On the top level, you see the mechanisms. I call them the nature of tactic inducements. I call them inducements, which are either confrontation or constructive. Sometimes I also use coercive instead of confrontational. Sometimes I use persuasive instead of constructive, or in addition. And basically, you can do things or say things or not do things either in confrontational or creative ways. If you want to be really simplistic about it, carrots and sticks, rewards and threats or costs. And I think it's useful to organize the universe of nonviolent action, which is enormously vast, into these, it's very dualistic, into the kind of confrontational versus constructive kind of approaches to action. And so with these very simple mechanisms, the controlling resources and then confrontational and constructive approaches, I feel like this is one way to categorize and understand the vast universe of nonviolent action. You can see the 6 categories that are there. The new category that I don't think anybody's ever come up with before that emerged from this is this category on the right-hand side called refraining or cooperation. This is a very unusual category because you don't usually cooperate with an opponent, but there are examples of halting or calling off a planned or ongoing strike or action to reward or persuade. Gandhi was very famous for having done this in South Africa in the 1890s when he called off a train strike to be nice to as a reward to the Brits. In any case, we need a doctoral dissertation on that particular aspect of not doing something that is a constructive action. There are not many of them, but it's an interesting area of work. So with that, I would just say that the world of nonviolent resistance is growing. It's happening on a vast scale at both very grand political levels and then also at community levels. And I've pretty much used my first 15 minutes up. I have so much more to say, but I just hope these initial ideas and thoughts are helpful starting places for you in terms of the dialogue we have today.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So I'll let then now Richard and Leanne to ask some questions.
Thank you. Michael, I have been both a fan and a critic. I certainly a user of the 198 methods for a very long time. And I feel also as if I have been waiting for this document that you have produced. It was exhilarating, nothing short of exhilarating to read it. And there are a number of questions that rose up for me, but I would like to, it really was great fun. I wanted to focus a bit of attention on Ukraine in particular. I did not realize that this was one of 3 focus countries for Nonviolence International. And I remember reading, it was George Lakey and Daniel Hunter writing early on, late February, about some tactics that had been used in terms of civil defense. The streets agency that had ordered everyone to take down signs and reverse signs and move signs around and so on. And citizens had also used cranes and so on to put cement blocks in the way and whatever they could do to make it difficult for the Russians to invade. So except for that moment, I have seen very little writing about, maybe I'm looking in the wrong places clearly, that have lifted up an ongoing or picking up that encouraging note in terms of civilian defense. Could you give us a sense, was there a moment where civil defense was civilian resistance was at a particularly fertile moment? Has it been lost? I wonder if you could say a bit about that.
Let me just say that I'm not an expert on Ukraine. Я не говорю по-русски or ukrainsky, so I'm not an expert on Ukraine, but I spent a lot of time with our colleagues there who are experts. There's been a hot war since 2014.
Right.
So was there a fertile moment before 2014? Yes, but that's long past gone. And with the invasion in February 24, with the military defeat within the week of the Russian invasion towards Kiev, sorry, any chance for the population to consider nonviolent action went out the window, because people like, wow, we can win this militarily. So they had a very quick military victory, and people like, wow, okay, let's invest in this because it's working. And people are pretty pragmatic, okay? People are not coming at this ideologically like, hey, what's going to work? And if they think that military can work, they're going to invest in military. And our people in Ukraine, our Russians in Ukraine, and our Russians have been saying for the last year or two that if there was an all-out war, that the Ukrainians would probably win, quote unquote, if anybody can win a modern war with the enormous amount of destruction and whatnot that can and does occur, that Ukraine was likely to win a war with Russia. So this is at least what we've been our nonviolent experts have been saying, but this is, I think, what the people and the Ukrainian army believe, and they believe that they can win militarily. And so for us to say, hey, we should really try something different at this time, there's not really open to that. Typically what we see historically is that people try violent action, violent resistance, armed resistance or whatever. It doesn't work well. And then they try nonviolent action, sometimes by accident, and they're sometimes surprised that it does work. This has been typically the approach. I think civilian-based defense had an opportunity to work in Ukraine in a way that there were some reasons why a civilian-based defense approach or social defense could have worked very usefully, because in particular of the language compatibility. Ukrainians, virtually all Ukrainians know Russian, or at least can understand Russian, and most can communicate in Russian, and many can communicate natively in Russian. And so one of the key ways of undermining an opponent who comes and invades and occupies your territory is your ability to communicate with them and communicate at a very sophisticated level in terms of ideals and morals and values and narratives of all kinds, and on understanding the cultural complexities of the invading force. And so Ukrainians are very well equipped to handle a Russian invasion from a kind of a social defense, civilian-based defense standpoint. They also, of course, have neighboring territory that neighbors on friendly countries that could provide them ongoing support. And so I think a civilian-based defense approach is and was a plausible direction for Ukraine to go. But the idea that they're now going to stop using the military when they're seeing very significant military victories, even as we speak today and yesterday, there have been substantial advances on the parts of Ukrainians. It's just not going to, it's not going to happen. But what we've been doing is that Nonviolence International believes that nonviolence can happen and should happen, and we should be promoting it even if there is a war going on. And so what we've done is we've supported, we brought together about 5 weeks ago, we brought together people from the occupied territories. We snuck them into Kyiv, and we had 2-a-day meeting with them and asked them, what do they want? What kind of nonviolent resistance do they think is plausible and doable in the occupied territories? And what do they want? And the number one thing they wanted was they wanted clandestine underground schools for their kids. So their kids didn't have to be indoctrinated and go to Russian schools. And they asked specifically that we approach Zoom for licenses for the teachers in Ukraine and the Ministry of Education so that we could be teaching not just the diaspora kids in Poland and around the world, but the kids who are trapped inside occupied Ukraine. And we had another meeting last Sunday or Saturday with the teachers and the people who are helping to organize this to teach this underground clandestine schooling for Ukrainians so they could keep their language and they keep on track with their education school. So that is an interesting little tidbit of nonviolent resistance that we're actively working on at the moment. In terms of nonviolent resistance having an impact on the conflict, the key thing here is that there's not a lot that can be done in a war zone, but if you expand, one of the great things about nonviolence is you can expand the battlefield much more readily than you can with an armed struggle. Notice how the United States and NATO has not wanted to directly be involved, or other countries directly engaged to have this be a world war fought all over the world. But this is a nonviolent war that can be fought more broadly around the world. And so sanctions on Russia or the voices and the resources of the globe can be brought to bear. And Ukrainians have been trying to get diplomatic and other sanctions and peoples engaged around the world raising money for this, that, and the other, to try to help pressure Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. And so we haven't done a great job in this world, done an okay job. We haven't done a great job of expanding the nonviolent battlefield to the whole world to pressure Russia. But that is still something that is ongoing. And the other very key aspect that Nonviolence International is working on is trying to support the nonviolent resistance within Russia against the war. And we have a number of reports on our website that are buried on our website that I can try to get to you if you're interested. We did very sophisticated analysis of public opinion within Russia as best can be done, and trying to come up with messages and approaches for resistance within Russia at this time against the Russian war. The most obvious thing that is in the cards in terms of resistance at the moment are the 700,000 people that have fled Russia since January, as well as the 200,000 people that have fled in the last 10 days. And I'm very concerned. We at Nonviolence International want to try to pull together a global meeting of people to see what we can do to support the ongoing fleeing from Russia of all these young men, in particular in their 20s, to flee Russia, to Kazakhstan, to Turkey, and other places. And we have hundreds of thousands of these folks, but they need support. They're going to need visas. They're going to need asylum. They're going to need resources. And is anybody really speaking up for them? And unfortunately, to date, nobody has really stepped up yet. And I think we could really help accelerate the fleeing from Russia and the reduced number of people that could serve in the Russian military if we could do a better job of supporting those people who are running away. I will say as an aside, in late January, we approached the US government very high up and said, we know that this invasion is likely to happen, and we know that you probably are going to want to throw in a lot of weapons. And we think the best thing to do now, ahead of the invasion, is to announce that anybody from Russia or Belarus or Ukraine who's a conscientious objector, who does not wish to fight in this war, will get asylum and or support for them and maybe their families in Europe and or the United States or other countries. And could you please put this word out in advance? But unfortunately, this nonviolent approach was not something the US government was very interested in. They're very happy to throw in weapons. We think that undermining the Russian military from the get-go would have been a very effective strategy and could have really changed dynamics on the ground in a very dramatic way much earlier on. So I hope I haven't gone on too long and have answered your question, but I'll
that was wonderful. That was wonderful, more than I would have expected. And perhaps, Michael, after this is over, at some point you could be in touch with Science for Peace to give us some ideas by which we could support the kind of thing that you're talking about with those who are in the diaspora, those the 900,000 by now. That would be good to know. Thanks very much. I really appreciate. I am feeling what I hope others are feeling as well, the glass half full approach to this. Thanks. That was great. I appreciate it.
Okay, Michael, I'd like to echo Leanne's praise for your book. I think it's really fantastic. I mean,
thank you.
You not only have extended Gene Sharp's work by adding a lot of new tactics, but as well you clarified his work. You clarified the whole understanding of tactics. Before, in reading, I'd read a lot of Gene Sharp, and I had trouble remembering the various divisions because they weren't logical. They didn't lodge in one's mind. But to say have three categories: saying, not doing, and doing, that's enough in my mind. Just to, and also have the subcategories of positive and negative,
sure, confrontation,
constructive and destructive. Makes a great deal of sense. So you made an enormous contribution just in that way.
Oh, thank you.
What I'd like to do, if I may, is to switch the discussion from Ukraine to the actual nonviolent theory itself, because there are a couple of things that have concerned me about the Sharp approach, not just by Sharp, but by so many of his those who followed in his footsteps. And I'd like to get your opinion on my or your outlook on the kind of problems I have. One is I could perhaps just use the word context. That too rarely in Sharp's work, and perhaps also in your work, are tactics understood in context. I think context is very important because you know, there's sometimes given the idea is given that the tactics are applicable in all circumstances. And I know some people actually said that's the case and argued very strongly for it, but I don't think it's true. I mean, you know, you have said, and Sharp has said, that effective nonviolent action requires organization, training, and leadership, able to actually strategically shift when circumstances change. So all of that training, organization, and leadership all require a kind of openness, an ability to communicate with members of the organization, and especially training, of course, would be very important. And so it seems to me that it might be more accurate if we thought in terms of the efficacy of tactics. If you begin like on a continuum, imagine a continuum, where on the left side is democracy, in the middle authoritarianism, and on the far right totalitarianism. The closer you get to democracy, the more openness there is, the ability to communicate, the easier it is to organize effective nonviolent actions. The closer you move towards authoritarianism and beyond, to very repressive forms of authoritarianism, plus this totalitarianism, and like Stalinist Russia, China under Mao, and also China today, in those circumstances, it's very hard to think of nonviolent action. I mean, one very graphic illustration is the fact that nonviolent resistance was very active in Hong Kong until the Chinese implemented their security law, and they managed to close down nonviolent action in Hong Kong very, very quickly. A very vibrant movement was reduced through repression and the control of information. So the problem I see is that the internet was certainly advantageous to activists in the early period, in the late 1990s into the 2000s, for communication, for mobilizing people, for fundraising, for, you know, organizing activities, publicizing them. But then, you know, things changed. The authoritarian governments in particular, China in particular, learned how to use the internet for their purposes, for misinformation, to divide movements, to try and portray the protesters as being dangerous terrorists, and generally to trace leaders, which became very easy with certain kinds of facial recognition technology, the use of cell phone tracing, to identify the leaders and to eliminate them, right? Eliminate them either through prison or even through assassination. So I think, you know, context is really important today in talking about nonviolent resistance. And, you know, context, in my view, could be thought about in terms of this spectrum. And we could, it is probably the better part of modesty and of realism to suggest that in certain very authoritarian contexts and totalitarianism, that movements for liberty and freedom and rights may in fact have to use violence. And nonviolence is not really a tactic that's likely to work. But there are circumstances in which violence can be justified. That's just one idea I would like to float for you, Michael.
Well, I think you speak for many here. This analysis is shared by many that we're very concerned about in the contestation of society versus governments that, and in some cases corporations, they are able to use the power of computing in a way to substantially repress populations and control populations and manipulate populations, and that there's a real tug of war going on. Your China example is a little complicated because there are thousands of nonviolent protests in China every year. The number, somebody's tracking it. It's shocking, the number of nonviolent protests that are even recorded every year in China. It's in the thousands and thousands. It's a very impressive number, and it's been going up despite the almost totalitarian in some respects use of computers and the internet by the China Communist Party. So and there's certain social movements in China that are making progress. I think we slowly are making progress, but it's on a vast scale, mind you. I think the women's movement is making progress in China. I think the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender movements are making progress in China. For example, these are very important movements. I mean, women are half the population of China, right? LGBTQ people are at least 10%, 15% of the population. So you're talking about vast populations that are marching forward. They're not confronting state power directly, but they are confronting society and social norms and all kinds of institutions and structures, and are moving on them. That's just to let you know that things are complicated. The nonviolent action primarily is the use of social power. And my guess is that it's going to be increasingly powerful and useful in a more interconnected world. And yes, China is authoritarian, whatever we use the words on it, but quite repressive. But it's still an enormously complex society, increasingly complex society. And whenever you have complexity, you have the opportunity, and social complexity, economic complexity, you have the opportunity for social power to be disruptive, because most of what we talk about when we talk about nonviolence is we're talking about disruption. In many cases, it's a confrontational disruption, but in other cases, it can be a constructive disruption. There are just myriads of opportunities for disruption in an increasingly interconnected world, even in repressive and authoritarian states. One of the reasons why nonviolent action is not always the best course of action or so easy in what we would call democracies or semi-democracies is that there are already institutions, you could call them nonviolent institutions, like elections, like court systems that are based on constitutions. In any case, and in some countries you have jury systems which use sortition, or kind of an alternative, the original democracy in the judicial system to render judgments on their fellow citizens. You have lobbying that can be done, for example, in a very institutionalized way in democracies or semi-democracies that provide an outlet or provide a way forward for people to get their needs met, that nonviolent action sometimes doesn't have as much impact in a democratic country, because there are these other alternatives to getting people's needs met. So I don't know, that's a complicated answer to your question. We all are very concerned about this contestation between the people and modern repressive governments. But let's not just focus on the seizure of political power. Let's broaden it to also include social movements and broad social change. And we even heard the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran make a concession, I believe, in the speech 2 days ago, saying, well, maybe we shouldn't enforce the hijab so strictly. I mean, imagine that coming out of his mouth. That's extraordinary, in my view. So I hope that was a little bit of a helpful response to your question. It deserves a lot more, and there are a lot of other people here that should talk and chime in on this as well. So I'll stop.
Just a very fast rejoinder. Wouldn't many of these nonviolent protests in China be largely improvised and largely local rather than national?
Yes, that's true.
A more effective one would be able to organize nationally, and that's the point at which the power of the state comes to bear.
That's true. And our transnational movements are just so weak. We all know this, and we all know we have to put energy into this. I talked about the transnational movement to try to pressure Russia, but when it comes to climate change, when it comes to food, and when it comes to energy, when it comes to pandemic, all these things really require very substantial transnational movements. And we got some labor unions, we've got some religious groups out there, but honestly, the global peace movement is just, it's almost an embarrassment. We have a very, very weak, almost when it comes to a international consumer movement, almost non-existent. I mean, there are just huge arenas in which either at the national or even at the transnational level, we really need to scale up on nonviolent organizing and resistance in a big way to meet the challenges that are in front of us. And so you make a good point that, yeah, local stuff, yeah, okay, but how do we scale it, particularly with a lot of authoritarian repressive opponents, including corporations?
Okay, Richard, I guess given the time, I think it's, I guess, the turn for the questions. So I will ask people that are interested in putting forward some questions to use the symbol reactions at the bottom of your screen and just choose the raising hand symbol so that Melissa will coordinate the order of the questions for Michael.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'll just keep talking. I do have something I'd like to share on Ukraine. It's not exactly in the core of nonviolent resistance, but I do feel like there is a strategic approach that we all should be thinking about supporting to helping end the war in Ukraine. And that is that I think that the war is unlikely to come to an end solely through a military defeat. It's possible Ukraine may completely defeat Russia, but we all know that nuclear weapons are out there, and it's very, very rough. And the amount of destruction is absolutely enormous. What I think is needed is, I think incentives or rewards are needed from the West, from the United States, from Canada, in order to help make a peace agreement work. Because I think that Ukraine is not going to want to stop fighting under many circumstances, even though Russia and the West may be wanting the fighting to stop. And so we need to be providing incentives, particularly incentives for Putin to withdraw. And there are three on the table that are obvious. One is that we can offer to withdraw sanctions. The second is what Oscar Arias put forward in his proposal about 2 months ago, which was that the United States should withdraw nuclear weapons from Europe as an incentive for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, so that Putin could say, he got a concession. This is what he was after all along, is to get the United States nuclear weapons out of Europe and security, blah, blah, blah. The other proposal that I have is that the United States withdraw its permanent troops from Europe after 77 years of occupation of Europe, and that the United States offer to remove our permanent troops from Europe as an incentive to help get Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. So I just want to put on the table here that there, strategically speaking, there are in ways, and I think incentives, that we could provide to help Russia save face a little bit, and for them to withdraw from Ukraine, and also move things in a good direction from our standpoint as people that don't want the United States to serve as the world's police and would like to move towards a better global security arrangement, so that the United States could start winding down some of these unhelpful arrangements that we have now. So that, I'd just throw something else out there for Ukraine, trying to be practical for people and not just be fuzzy wuzzy, peace, love, and yogurt, but try to give substantial, ideas.
Thanks, Michael. I wonder whether either Richard or Leanne, I'm sure they had questions that they didn't ask yet, and whether any of you two want to go ahead with the question.
I have, Arndt's got a question. I cede the microphone to Arndt.
Oh, thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt your question.
No,
I
you
was
go
perfectly
ahead.
happy to wait. But one thing that occurs to me is that one of the biggest incentives that was on the table all along in terms of getting the Russians toward negotiation was the reopening of the gas business with Europe. And that obviously has been taken off the table at this point by forces that we're not entirely sure of what the authorship of that particular measure was, but that seems to indicate that there are forces that want this conflict to continue, and in that regard, I mean, as much as I like the ideas that were put forward in terms of by Michael in terms of getting U.S. nukes out of Europe as well as U.S. Troops out of Europe. I somehow can't see the Americans agreeing to that. And one of the things that strikes me as being the immediate rejoinder to even making that suggestion is if we think back to 1991. One of the reasons why the Americans refused to democratize Kuwait at the time is because they explained that that would be a victory for Saddam Hussein, that would allow Saddam Hussein to claim that he achieved something that was simply intolerable for that reason. In that same sense, it would be argued that this would be an enormous reward to Putin and would for that reason be unacceptable. Anyway, just wanted to throw that out there.
Is that it? Was a question or?
Well, I guess,
I agree.
yeah, I guess, sorry.
I agree. I don't think the Europeans or the Americans really actually, they're all very militarily oriented, and I don't think that many of them are wanting that either of those proposals I put forward. People aren't even wanting to let go of the sanctions. People are not wanting to let Putin off the hook. And there are a lot of Russians that don't want to let Putin off the hook. There are a lot of Russians like, we don't want to do anything that allows Putin to stay into power. But, you know, he's got his hand on the nuclear buttons and among other things. And we may need to be, I think we need to be thinking in ways that prevent the nuclear bombs from going off and try to accelerate the end of this war. Yeah. There are some mistakes also on the American side. The American side is saying we're trying to weaken Putin. This kind of stuff, that stuff's not helpful. The United States should also, and the West should be very clearly saying, we don't want to destroy Russia. We want a strong, vibrant Russia. We're not here to tear it apart and have a civil war in Russia. But unfortunately, we're not having the wisest political leadership. And it's very clear that there is anti-Russian sentiment going on here that's not healthy, that's not good. And it's going to make this a lot more difficult to resolve.
We have a question from Lynn.
Yeah, hi, Michael. Long time no see.
Long time no see.
Lynn Adamson here, yes. So I really was wanting to ask you a little bit more about the nuclear question. Well, really, it's kind of a double question. The likelihood of that threat coming to pass. And then the fact is, you know, I've spent my life in mediation, and you always have to have kind of a golden bridge for people to kind of retreat from their positioning.
Right.
So they have somewhere to go that gives them a sense of dignity or somehow an acceptable way out. So I wondered if you had any comments about paths that might be there to facilitate that.
Yeah, I agree with you. In terms of nuclear weapons, I mean, there are a lot of people here that are probably more knowledgeable than I. But my Russian friends believe that this threat has been very credible since February, and that we have a very significant likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons by Putin. They're already being used every day by all of us, but by exploding nuclear weapons, and that this is a very plausible, likely scenario. Not only will it kill a lot of people, of course, and cause enormous destruction and set all kinds of precedents around the world, but it's also going to be happening probably in one of the premier breadbaskets of the world. And imagine contaminating one of the places that feeds the world, and the long-term environmental consequences already of this war conventionally, let alone what nuclear explosions will do in one of the most important food growing areas in the world. It's very, very disturbing. The Golden Bridge alludes to the suggestions that I made earlier, that Oscar Arias made and that I made. These are golden bridges for Putin to withdraw and getting concessions from Europe that can save face and have him withdraw from Ukraine. I'd be open to other ideas. The folks that we believe can most pressure Putin to not use the nuclear weapons are China and India, meaning Prime Minister Modi and Chairman Xi. And we've been saying this for 6 months, and we still believe that these are the two entities that he is most, that and of course the Russian people internally. These are the areas of pressure to try to prevent him from going to the nuclear. But I would add one other problem, and that is that perhaps worse than nuclear explosion is the possibility of a major attack on the nuclear power plants, because there you would have meltdowns, and you could have radiation spewing out in a dumpster fire for hundreds or thousands of years, in a way that a nuclear bomb would be horrific, but not, in some ways, not as bad. So these nuclear power plants are at enormous risk and could be incredibly damaging if they were damaged in a particular way that caused meltdowns and ongoing problem for thousands of years.
Thank you.
Hope I answered you a little bit. I don't have any other golden bridge ideas.
Yeah.
Maybe other people have golden bridge ideas.
Richard, you had a question?
Yeah, I always have another question. I got such an interesting interlocutor here, and yeah. So I like to get, however, back to the theory of nonviolent action, basically, which you made such an enormous contribution. And I really want to hear your views on this next issue, which is the issue of violence in nonviolent action. Of course, Gene Sharp suggested very strongly that violence and nonviolence do not mix. That nonviolent action must be highly disciplined, even in the face of great repression. And he allowed that there might be some kind of destruction of property, but even then, it was very, very skeptical about that tactic. I noticed in your own book that at the end, the final chapter, you do have a section on violent acts that sometimes go along with nonviolence, and you specify three or four, I think, total. It seems to me that in the real world of nonviolent action, there is a lot of violence, and it's not clear for those successful campaigns whether it was the nonviolent action or the violent actions that were most germane to the success of the outcome. And the civil rights movement in the United States is often idealized as a great success of nonviolent action with Martin Luther King. And certainly he deserves an enormous amount of credit. He's showing he and his colleagues showed an enormous amount of courage in what they did. But I mean, even in this case, we had not orchestrated by King or his followers, but by others. We had Malcolm X rhetoric of basically rage, really articulating the rage of many Black people. We had the ghetto riots and arson in the cities in the mid-1960s. We had the Deacons for Justice with their arms protecting the Congress of
Racial equality.
core members, and also other peace activists, civil rights activists at that time. We had the Black Panthers, who were armed and patrolling and certainly regarded as very dangerous by the FBI. So I just take this as an example of what really goes on in some of these campaigns that are regarded as successful nonviolent campaigns. Maybe we need to rethink the idea that violent and nonviolent actions do not mix, given the actual reality of so many cases. Even in India, there's a great deal. Although Gandhi again was a very amazing leader and with his showed great courage, etc., in his campaigns. There's also violence going on at the same time as the SALT protests. And again, the fear of violence and so on might have been important. So I'm not trying to at all undermine civil resistance as a very, very important way of attaining justice or freedom, rights, or a sustainable environment. What I'm just trying to broach towards is an understanding of what is the relationship between violence and nonviolence in reality. I wonder if you can help me on that.
Well, it's complicated. There's so many different things. I would say that there's a significant difference between social equality movements. We often call them social movements, but social equality movements and movements that are trying to seize state power and political power through nonviolent action. And I would say the civil rights movement is overwhelmingly nonviolent action. Yes, there were armed actors, but I don't think they had significant impact on the changes that happened. I think that was nonviolent action really was the overwhelming force that made the changes in the United States. And I think you can point to other social equality movements, the women's movement, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender movements that have had enormous changes around the world in the status of these peoples, and they've overwhelmingly been nonviolent. I think there's a lot to be said for nonviolence in social equality movements around the world. When it comes to seizing state power or polities, that's a trickier situation, and you do see more mixing in many contexts of nonviolent action and violent action. Sometimes the nonviolence and violence frame is not the best one to use. Some people use the frame, what's the right thing to do and what's the effective thing to do? And those are their two queries, rather than trying to get into a debate about what is violent and what isn't. Another a way of approaching this is through the human rights lens. There's some folks there are a lot of people around the world that don't really get motivated by the nonviolence lens, but they get motivated by human rights defense and using that framework for organizing resistance and of course, when you have human rights and whatnot, there are situations in human rights where you have a right to defend yourself, so that you have the right to self-defense in certain particular situations and contexts and whatnot. So for some reason, some folks, the human rights defense is a better framework than nonviolence and violence. I would just finally say that in the context of Burma or other places, there have been times when you have both struggles going on at the same time. but they separate from each other. So they don't, particularly the violent does not contaminate the nonviolent one. And so you separate the violent and nonviolent struggles and campaigns by either geographically, maybe demographically, maybe it's women that mostly do the nonviolent struggle, and maybe it's the men that do most of the violence. Maybe you do it temporally, where the armed struggle happens at nighttime and the nonviolent struggle happens during the day. So there are examples of conflicts where people have tried to do them both at the same time, but have them separated to some degree, and sometimes even have slightly different political goals. And then there's just a lot of murkiness about what is violence and what is nonviolence. We can get a lot of debates about it. You know, doxing. Is doxing violent or nonviolent? I don't know. It really is highly contextual. When the Burmese resistance releases the private information of the military generals, most people would say that's just fine. But, you know, when Julian Assange, bless his heart, he did a lot of great things, but when he released all the health records of I don't know, hundreds of thousands or millions of Saudi people, was that really, you know, an appropriate release of information when you're releasing people's personal health records who aren't necessarily supporters of the regime? I don't know, where do you draw the line, and under what context are these things really violations of people's human rights in a major way, and when is it justified and when isn't it? It's very complicated. I don't pretend to have all the answers on that. I would say that the core of persuasion and appeal that Gandhi spent so much time and effort on is something that we would still hold open as something that we should not be just thrown under the bus of violent and nonviolent coercion, that we do want to try to preserve as much persuasion and appeal as we possibly can in struggles to the best of our ability. And that maybe we just try to maximize that as much as we can while still trying to get our needs met. I don't know if I fully answered your question in a quick way, but those are some various ideas and approaches at thinking about violence and nonviolence.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we are about the 5:06, so I think we should wrap up. I want to really thank Michael for this really very interesting presentation and his answers to all the questions. I found this very I mean, I think it's an optimistic view in the middle of a very bleak situation internationally. And I also want to thank Richard and Leanne for the questions, and all the other people that posed questions. And hopefully we will see you again in our next presentation that is going to be next month in November. What's the name of the speaker, Richard?
Maria Stephan.
Maria Stephan, okay.
Oh, Maria, she's a genius. She's amazing.
Isn't she? Yes.
So hopefully people will register for this presentation at the Science for Peace website. And so have a good night, and I'll see you hopefully.
Okay,
yes.
could I interrupt just briefly? I just wanted to say that I have put the link to the monograph in the chat for those of you who have not been able to, not yet downloaded it. And I urge you to have a look. And just a couple of wee things to Michael. I'm with Shaska on logistical supports, and I'm very intrigued with the exclusion of TPNI. So those are cryptic, and I agree with much of it, but not all of it. Okay, another conversation perhaps.
And I'm happy to speak in all of your classes or to your groups about my book. So just invite me. I'm happy to talk. Great.
Okay, and finally, I want to thank Melissa for coordinating all this, all the event, and everybody have a good night. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.